Hello and welcome to the Trans Agenda, a podcast by Trans Clinique. I'm your host, Nico, and I'm a trans man and my pronouns are he and they. Every Thursday at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, we'll be right here talking about the Trans Agenda. In this podcast, we'll delve into the unique challenges and experiences of trans folks, highlighting the voices of those who have lived it themselves. We'll explore issues such as navigating medical and legal systems, finding acceptance within family and community, and combating discrimination and violence. Our guests will share their personal stories and expertise, providing valuable insights and perspectives on this often misunderstood aspect of the human experience. Join us as we strive to educate, inform, and advocate for trans rights and visibility. All right, hello, and welcome to the Trans Agenda. My name is Nico, and I'm your host, and I'm here with Ro.
Hi, my name is Ro. My pronouns are he, him, and I identify as transmasculine.
Yeah, so Ro, tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do. I see you're wearing your Folsom Street Fair t-shirt. Let's
get into that. I professionally work as a dominant, a fetish educator, performer, now retired go-go because my knees are getting old, and reluctant PhD student.
Reluctant PhD
Reluctant.
student.
The reluctancy has to always be there.
So there's a lot there that I want to really get into. What is your degree in?
So my undergrad is in media communications with a minor in rhetoric, and I just graduated with my master's in rhetoric and composition from Houston, and my PhD is also going to be in rhetoric and composition.
Nice. What is that? So how does that manifest? What do you want to do with that?
The golden, that's the $1 million question, right?
Okay,
what do you want to do with that? Frankly, I tell people I don't really dream of labor, right? I think for everyone, especially just going into a PhD, they're like, oh, what do you want to do with that? And honestly, I really try to use rhetoric, right? Looking at languages and symbols and the ways that we use language in order to create communities as a way to I see that as knowledge that can be spread everywhere.
Yeah.
For my community specifically, for leather communities, BDSM communities, queer communities.
That's beautiful. I mean, I have a degree. Well, I have 2 degrees in psychology.
Ooh.
And people are always like, oh, you want to be a therapist? I'm like,
absolutely not.
Yeah. No. I respect therapists. And it is because of that respect that I do not want to be one.
Yeah, totally.
For me, it's I just had some questions that I wanted answered, and I feel like it was applicable to my life. So, it is what it is. I use it, even here. So that's cool.
Yeah, absolutely. I resonate with that. For me, looking at language as a way into understanding the world I grew up in, right? These systems of oppression that we live in constantly, right? I think rhetoric and composition was one way that I was able to investigate the world, kind of psychology sounds like a way you were able to investigate your world.
Yeah, like a lens. I love that.
For sure.
Speaking of lenses, I wonder, so you said you're really involved in the leather, you're professional dominant. How did you get involved? Is it, I just kind of want to know, was that something when you were young queer person that you were I want to grow up to be a leather daddy? Or did you fall into it? You know what I mean?
Yeah. So I definitely think I fell into it. I was really fortunate to grow up in matriarchy where I was the kid that told the other kids where babies came from and used the very proper for the time, right? Language as far as genitals go and all that. I had too much knowledge as a child.
Yeah.
So growing up and even coming out then as a very butch lesbian, my mom was very accepting. So then when I started sniffing around and wondering what are all these other things that folks are doing with their time? What is this leather thing? Why do I see these guys in chain harnesses and leather outfits? And with that investigation, that was also supported. And I think from there, I just kind of fell face first. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing for me personally about the leather community is that even though it's not identity based in the sense of your sexuality, your gender identity, it's something that people, I notice that people in that community, it's very much something that is very close to their hearts most of the time. Absolutely. Why do you I wonder what your opinion is, why is that? What is that connection?
So I actually recently wrote on this. Somebody asked me a very similar question, and I think for me personally, leather allowed me to find a sense of community and belonging that I didn't really have. I grew up with a single parent, not the kind of traditional nuclear family that I think a lot of folks tend to grow up with. And seeing the ways and the configurations of like family and even houses, and the ways that even, we see ballroom houses, leather houses, and the kind of configurations of communities that can be made there. I think ultimately that's the source of the intrigue, and that continues to be the reason why I'm like leather and the leather community is like so profound and close to me.
Yeah, and I can definitely see that, across the board. I live in San Francisco. The leather community is like very big there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's also pride is very big there, right? Mm-hmm. And so there is a little bit of, well, there's a lot of overlap.
A little bit.
a little bit, yeah. And so I'm wondering, there's a lot of discussion about kink and pride and leather and pride.
Oh,
and
yeah.
For those of our viewers who don't actually know, do you think you could go over a little bit of the history around that and the importance of keeping kink and pride?
Sure. I mean, my synopsis is kind of really cut and dry. When we had some of the soldiers coming home, they were coming home to San Francisco, right? And from there, you end up getting a lot of the leather military kind of bluff, what we call bluff uniform style. And with that ends up coming leather clubs, leather bars, eventually, which ends up streamlining into these festivals, which we end up with, the Folsom Street Festival. We're going on our 40th year, as a way to combat not only displacement and gentrification, but also sexual liberation. That was kind of taking off in San Francisco as like the some people call it the Mecca of queerness in the 70s and 80s. And I think part of the conversation around like kink at Pride is, for me, first and foremost, remembrance that you do not get these festivals without looking back and seeing leather people and trans people, right? Like trans leather people, which are also kept out of even the conversation around leather itself. But like I said, for me, it's very cut and dry. Like, in order for us to create this history and look back, right, at Pride festivals, we have to then see that Pride festivals are part and parcel of the leather communities that are incoming during a very particular time in our country.
Yeah, and I'm such a history nerd. Like,
oh, me too. Yeah. Me too. We should have been history majors.
There we go. That's the next PhD I'm going to get. So, and you beat me to my next question, which is kind of like, how is it being in the leather space as a trans person? And at that, as a trans masculine person?
Sure. Yeah, tricky. Or can be. I think how it felt and how it feels has transformed over time, and I think a lot of that has to do with choosing to medically transition and take testosterone, right? And also the continued growing pains of the community, right? So I think when I was younger, and I always got like mistaken for a boy when I was younger. I was pushed out of restrooms. I mean, so I had a very particular kind of experience even as a woman. Mm-hmm. So being even a woman in leather spaces when it was very cis male centered was one particular kind of experience. And then, coming into my own sense of my masculinity, my transness, now it's learning to navigate these whole other kind of microcosms, these different ecologies that we have, right? Because, I mean, we see this in the queer community too, right? Like the ways that we kind of operate in trans mask parties, like when I go to Bonus, right? Like we have our own way of being with each other, even like our own language practices, our own cruising practices, right? And then going into cis men's leather spaces, right? We have to acknowledge that like not all cis men have the language or even the background to start with, like even pronouns, right? Like I've met a lot of cis men who are just like, wait, what's a pronoun? And I'm like, you use them every day, right?
Yeah.
But sometimes I think those are some of the growing pains in like having these conversations. And if I only see you in a bar, that might not be the best forum to have these conversations.
And my question, so I totally see that, and being in the club scene around totally different spectrums of queer people, it's like you really see a lot of that friction, right?
Oh,
and
absolutely.
that friction, anytime you bring two communities that aren't used to hanging out together, either if that's through music, through culture, through leather and, rainbow tutus or whatever, like you get a lot of that friction.
Absolutely.
And so I wonder, like, for you, do you approach that with empathy? Do you approach that with kind of like, okay, you should know better, like we live in the internet age, like what is your take on that? I personally go back and forth. It's hard for me it depends on my mood, I guess, but I'm curious how you approach that.
So I think it's also like similar for me. Sometimes I have the capacity to engage in this conversation in the middle of a bar about how you just didn't know and everything is so new and changing. And some days I'm just like, listen, I'm here for a beer. I don't want to hear it, right? Like at the end of the day, just get my pronouns right at the very least, and like we'll just keep it pushing.
Yeah.
But overall, I really try, and I think that's all we can really do. Like at our heart is really try to just hold a lot of grace for folks and hope that they're coming to me as they are with the tools they have in that moment. And I think that is ultimately what I try to hold before I go out to, like, particularly, right, like cis gay men's centered events, is like just taking a deep breath and saying people approach you as they are with the tools they have in that moment.
Yeah.
And that's not always pretty. And I also don't have to take no shit.
And that's great, is to have that confidence in yourself that you don't have to take shit, because simultaneously for me, it's like, I know that I don't owe people education.
Absolutely.
And I also strongly believe that the practice of community, and I do think that it's a practice and I do think it's a verb, is that you need to participate in like that communal knowledge seeking and like whatever, but it's so difficult and whatever.
It's hard when you're on the teaching end of that really often, and it can be really burdensome, but I really try to hold fast to the point of like, okay, take a deep breath. If he's saying he doesn't understand pronouns, and I've established where he is in this conversation. So going past the point of like really trying to linguistically blow his mind with like Z here pronouns and like all these, the neo pronouns, or even like past the point of like what a lot of people still assume is like M to F and F to M, is just like, we are only so far. So I think also listening to where people are telling you they are, and not trying to jump ahead, because I think often that's where we find a lot of heavy confrontation. It's like we don't really listen to where people are telling us they are in that moment.
Well, and I think another great thing about the leather community is the care aspect of it, right? Is not only the self-care and the aftercare and the community care, but
all the care.
Yeah, and so I wonder, like, what are your care practices really
in BDSM or in life? Like in every day.
Any interpret it however you want.
Sure. Wow, you hit me with the question I didn't anticipate. Wow. So I think that when it comes to, right, like my lens tends to be very like leather BDSM, right? I think when folks think about care, it's like immediate aftercare, and it's affection, it's making sure you're hydrating, it's all those things, right? And they tend to be centered on who you're engaging with, right? If we play together, it's like, okay, what do you need at that moment? And I think what BDSM has taught me is like introspectively looking at myself and like, what do you need? What is it that you need? Because and I try to, even if it's like, I'm a Lego fanatic, like I love Legos. If you love Legos, please let me know. But so even if it's just like art, like even if it's like crappy art, some art I make is like not beautiful at all. But
crappy art's great.
Crappy art is great. But I think for me, like care, I'm starting to realize is more centered on even just listening to like my intuition, what I want in that moment. It can be anything from like, I want some soda right now, to like, you need a nap. You've been just going all weekend, like please take a nap. And I think growing up poor, growing up like just in poverty, we're not taught to listen to ourselves a lot, which I think inhibits our ability to know how to care for ourselves. Mm-hmm. Because if it doesn't make money, it doesn't make sense.
No.
So I think I'm still realizing what that care might look like for me. But at the very least, right now, it's like Legos and hydration.
Legos and hydration. Well, that's a hashtag that I'm
included in that. Hydration.
Well, and I think it's interesting, like trans people, like you said, we are kept away from our mechanisms of checking in with the self, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's why, for me, the leather community, whenever I meet somebody, I notice that people are very, like, they're better, not perfect, nobody is, but better at checking in with their internal worlds typically. So that was why I was curious about the care, sure. You know what I mean? So
yeah, absolutely.
It's interesting. Well, I love having you on the podcast. It's been super interesting to talk to you. And I feel like I could go for another hour.
Keep going.
But I do want to ask you a question I ask everybody on the podcast, which is, what is your trans agenda?
Unabashed, unashamed pleasure.
Ooh.
For everybody.
Right there.
Find it.
I love it. All right, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Trans individuals face unique challenges every day. From accessing healthcare to navigating legal systems, it is crucial that we work towards creating a society that is inclusive and supportive of people of all gender identities. This means advocating for policies and practices that prioritize the health and well-being of trans individuals, as well as challenging discriminatory attitudes and behaviors where they exist. By coming together to support and uplift trans voices, we can create a brighter and more equitable future for everyone. Thank you for listening, and let us continue to work towards a world where trans individuals can thrive. Follow us on all social media platforms @transclinique, and don't forget to like this video and hit the subscribe button.